We both moved to London to go to Goldsmiths and
spent all of the 90s in London.
Yeah.
Half of the 90s at Goldsmiths Art School.
It was kind of, the art scene in London in the 90s was kind of interesting because early in the 90s there was this kind of massive spike, the kind of what we now are meant to call the YBA generation, Damien Hirst and so on, and it kind of really shook up what going to art school meant, I think, because before that, a kind of a BA level art school was kind of something you did in order to be able to qualify to do an MA, and it was all part of a long kind of process, and suddenly these kind of artists becoming super successful really quickly kind of shook all that up and created this idea that you could go to art school and very, very young, like in your 20s, have an almost rock star like kind of career. And so it made, by the time we got to Goldsmiths, it kind of made for a very strange atmosphere because it felt like everybody felt there was a very strong element of competition. It felt like everyone was competing with everyone else to get to that kind of get to success very, very quickly.
Yeah, it was kind of it was competitive, ruthless, but wholly insubstantial. I mean, people were making shit that meant nothing. The 90s was when we sort of stopped making art for a bit, started working together, and then tried to kind of figure out what to do, and decided to try and take some of the sensibility that we saw in independent music and in the way that independent labels and fanzines and bands were connecting with their audience and sort of try and take that back across to art, and we've been trying the same thing ever since, really. Britpop in particular was the start of the point where the mainstream began to kind of eat up indie and now indie is totally indie in that way, indie music and that kind of guitar type of thing is now completely mainstream. I mean, totally mainstream. It's X Factor, every X Factor audition is some bloke in a checky shirt with a acoustic guitar and, singing his little heart out. Yeah, it's just dreadful. There was a humour to it back then, a sort of quite a kind of delicious, kind of quite exciting humour about the way in which it was happening. That there were these kind of, fake competitions between bands.
But I think a lot of people told themselves that there was humour in it as a way to kind of reconcile it.
Yeah.
Like, I think there was a sort of a temptation for people to believe that Nick was having some sort of joke at Kylie's expense, that somehow she was the butt of some elaborate prank, and that sort of made it okay. So you didn't have to embrace pop. You didn't have to say, actually, Kylie's okay now because it was a prank.
Yeah.
And I think actually Nick was quite surprised by that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. There's a real earnestness to what he did and why he did it. Yeah. And back then, Pulp were way better than both Blur and Oasis. Pulp were much more interesting. We're maybe one of the first kind of sets of first generation to really grow up in that age of I feel closer to the video image, to the kind of the RGB split mediatized television screen image than I do to the kind of film stock.
Celluloid.
To celluloid,
totally.
yeah. And I get excited by it, the fizz of it, the texture of it, we recently discovered that we were both utterly turned on at the same time as 7-year-olds by the front cover of Adam and the Ants, Kings of the Wild Frontier, which is a frozen video still of Adam Ant, and you can see the kind of fizz of the video surface, and it kind of got us both as kids.
That seeing of the surface being something that isn't kind of to be kind of avoided, to be sort of apologised for, really has played such a big part in almost everything we've done, really. I mean, it's such a sort of key such a key idea that you can see the mediatisation, that it isn't a kind of invisible, that perhaps cinema has kind of been posited as a kind of window into another world, but that somehow television, or the smaller screen, is a window through which we see this world.
Yeah, and that it in itself as a surface is a language. Like, it allows you to speak in some way, to say something else about the thing that you're making. You're given another layer of language to access. We were never reenacting in order to examine the past, to kind of try and find out something about the thing that happened back then. We were always doing it to kind of hold up some kind of mirror to the present. Like, what was it about the culture that we were living in that permitted a past act to be replayed in the present moment, and for that to be done as cultural entertainment? I mean, when the 90s began, there were a handful of tribute bands, the big ones, the ABBAs and a couple of Beatles, not much else.
By the end, you'd have a tribute band before the band existed, almost. It was kind of ridiculous, but
it's an astonishing landslide in culture, and it's no mistake that we left reenactment behind, and we left it behind pretty much at the end of the 90s, because culture had slid. That weird friction that was happening had kind of there'd been a sort of mudslide into the mainstream, and the moment that it hits the mainstream, it's kind of no longer interesting, not because it's edgy or no longer edgy or cool, but because simply people understand it too well. You're always looking for those things that are about to hit culture, that are about to kind of slide into position, because they're the things that our mind is working at its hardest to try and kind of understand, and they're the things that play psychologically on our emotions in the most sort of fascinating way, I guess. Yeah. Fax machines. Fax machines.
Nearly an entire decade, and that's your problem, is it?
Yeah, that's not the deepest of problems that I could have. Yeah, we have a filing cabinet full of paper, of business transactions, of communication with some amazing people that happened through the 90s, that are now these kind of almost invisible kind of Turin shrouds, is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. The faintest of kind of letters on it. Faxes, terrible technology.
It's thermal paper, isn't it?
It's thermal paper.
So it just goes.
Yeah. And can you come up with something more meaningful?